The book of Ecclesiastes, or Kohelet in Hebrew, is a wisdom text that sort of offers some counter-testimony to the book of Proverbs. The author identifies himself as a son of David, king in Jerusalem. We happen to know a guy who was the son of David and king in Jerusalem. His name was Solomon. But the truth of the matter is, any king that would have sat on the throne in Jerusalem would have identified himself as a son of David, king in Jerusalem. That line of David continued in Jerusalem. The author calls himself Kohelet. We don't know exactly how to translate that. One who assembles the congregation, teacher. Some translations like preacher. I tend to stay away from that. We tend to have so much baggage with that word preacher. I wouldn't want to put too much of our culture on that word. So teacher is probably the best way to translate that. The language of the book is post-exilic. So whenever the book is said, and maybe it does reflect a much earlier tradition, we know the book is written down post-exile. It uses some of the Hebrew conventions you associate with post-exilic writing. The book is full of melancholy skepticism. It is skeptical, and it's a little depressed about that. The book is cynical about tradition and authority, and that includes the authority of God. The author does believe in God, but the author does not believe that God's ways can be known from experience. Now remember when we talked about Proverbs, that Proverbs was this indirect revelation, that you look at the world and you believe God designed the world to work according to certain systems and certain laws and certain rules, and you can know something of it the more you look at the world. Ecclesiastes says, no, you can't. There is nothing that you can learn necessarily of the will of God by observing the world in that way. I suppose the mission verse of Ecclesiastes is summed up at the beginning: meaningless, meaningless, utterly meaningless, everything is meaningless. It can be pretty depressing, and I understand that. But it is a canonical book, and because it's a canonical book, it is in the canon, it has something to teach us. And I think there's a positive side to the skepticism. It's a reminder that simple formulas can't contain God. You know, in Proverbs you have get up early, work hard, and things will go well. Well, you know, we know some people who work hard, for whom things don't go well. We know some lazy people who do pretty well. And Ecclesiastes comes along and says, don't pretend that God works in some sort of divine vending machine. You can't put in a nickel's worth of obedience and get back a nickel's worth of blessing. The world is more complicated than that. The God of Deuteronomic theology is just too small. The world doesn't quite work that way. As far as Kohelet is concerned, the complete nature of God is unknown and unknowable from our perspective. You can't just look around and pretend to that you have the full understanding of who God is. Basically, Kohelet reminds us to be realists. And we knew this, but it's nice to have the Bible come and tell us. This is when I say the canon is self-correcting. That pleasure and success are not necessarily reasons for optimism. You don't want to necessarily leap to the conclusion that Bill Gates or Steve Jobs are the most righteous people in the world. And sorrow and hard times are not necessarily signs of sin. Mother Teresa was not a wicked person because she died only with a pair of sandals and a robe and a rosary. You can't use those kinds of formulas to try and interpret in that way. Now, if God is that big, if you have that large a picture of God, if God is so large He's unknowable from our perspective, there's a really neat benefit to this. There's a profound sense of God's presence that can happen when that happens. If God is that big, if God can't be known and controlled by our perspective or what we do, then God can be present in every aspect of life. Everything in life is important. Think about it. If you're following the God of Deuteronomic theology, then if things are going bad in your life, it's obviously because you've sinned. Well, God can't abide in the presence of sin, so in your hard and dark time, God can't be there because obviously you're full of sin. Ecclesiastes comes along and says, no, hard times can come for any reason. It doesn't necessarily have to be because of sin. And now all of a sudden, God can be present when there's a time to weep and a time to dance and a time to mourn and a time to laugh and a time to gather stones and scatter stones. And in all of those times, God can be present. And in all the infinite many more times, God can be present. So I think it's helpful to remember to not take Proverbs and run without reading Ecclesiastes. As James Sanders reminds us, the canon is self-correcting.